And if you think gaming is trivial, well, you have to consider that most of the things that we build in the world are really just some form of games. And so if you can't have privacy as a game mechanic, it really, really limits you to what you can do.
Hi everyone, it's Joy and Salimi yet once again on another exciting episode of NewForum, and we're always happy to bring you awesome creators, founders, visionaries, and developers on our podcast.
And on today's episode, we have Jonathan Wu. He is handling the growth of Aztec, a layer 2 Ethereum network with privacy. And we're super excited to talk with him about how privacy can be used as a creative force for peace, the mission and vision behind Aztec. We will also discuss the biggest opportunities and challenges for blockchain networks and more on the topic of privacy and transparency in Web3. Hey, Jonathan, thanks again for joining us in this episode.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So as usual, I'd love to hear about, people's backgrounds and experiences, because I bet it all brought you to this place, exactly where you are today. So yeah, if you could share a bit of that.
Yeah, so I was a philosophy major undergrad. My joke is that I ended up a management consultant anyway. So I did management consulting for a few years, then realized that I loved that work, but I hated the job. And so I moved on to private equity. I was a private equity investor for a couple of years, and then ultimately ended up at business school. And then after business school, did a couple of ventures in real estate and food tech. And at the end of all that, kind of fell into the crypto rabbit hole because a couple of buddies of mine who had been investing since 2018 were telling me about DeFi, decentralized finance. And I used to be a finance guy, and I had always been a blockchain skeptic. I didn't really understand how it worked on a deep level, but decentralized finance made a lot of sense to me. So I started studying DeFi. That's kind of how I got into the space. And soon thereafter, I decided to go to the most extreme part of blockchain, the most kind of at the frontier part of it, which today is in the realm of zero knowledge proofs. And Aztec is one of the leading ZK projects out there. And so I now head growth there, which is essentially head of marketing, PR, comms at Aztec Network.
Amazing. I would love to know a bit more about Aztec, and could you explain maybe to the community what you guys are doing, and also why does protecting privacy matter so much in Web3?
Great questions. So the first thing is, you might have heard of other generalized computation layer 2s like Optimism and Arbitrum and ZK Sync. They are all trying to implement what's called the Ethereum virtual machine, which is the Ethereum world computer architecture on faster, cheaper networks that are built on top of Ethereum. We are also building our network on top of Ethereum, hence being a layer 2, but we're very privacy focused. And so we're privacy first, scalability second. So our goal is to both protect user privacy and scale the network. And as a result, we're not as compatible with EVM as our competitors are, because the EVM by definition is not privacy compatible. And so why are we so focused on privacy? Why is it so important? And I kind of think of privacy on 3 different levels. The most basic level is privacy as a form of discretion. So I just don't necessarily want everyone to see everything that I do on Ethereum. And I don't need to have a stronger reason than that to like privacy, right? If I were to tell you anyone in the world can read all your emails, it would just make you uncomfortable. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. You're just uncomfortable with someone looking over your shoulder. It's not a very safe or pleasant environment to be in. The second important aspect of privacy is security. If everyone can see everything that you're doing all the time, then they can attack you. Bored Ape Yacht Club holders know this, because they're oftentimes the victims of phishing attacks where you target a specific user, a specific Ethereum address, because you're aware of all of their holdings, how many tokens they have, which NFTs they hold. And so privacy is really critical for security as well. And then the last component, which is super important, is privacy as a creative force. So in a totally public blockchain paradigm, there are lots of things you can't do. For instance, if you and I want to make a bet and we don't want everyone else to see what that bet is, that type of game can't be played on Ethereum. Whereas on our system, we can place the bet onto a public blockchain. It's fully encrypted. and it can still execute and settle the bet that we have without everyone seeing what our side agreement was. Another good example is gaming. So there are some games that can be played in a purely public environment. Chess is a famous example where it's a perfect information game. Both players can see the board, observers can see the board, and it doesn't change the game. In fact, that's an important part of the game, that everyone can see what's going on. But let's say, Joy, you and I were to play cards, and we want to play a simple card game where I deal you a card and then I get dealt a card, and then we flip the card over and we see whose card is higher, and the card that's higher wins. Well, the problem with that is on Ethereum, if all the information is public, then everyone knows what the card values are. And so you can't really even play a very simple card game. And so there are many, many games like that that exist. And if you think gaming is trivial, well, you have to consider that most of the things that we build in the world are really just some form of game. So even private trading, private order book exchanges, those things are functionally just games. And so if you can't have privacy as a game mechanic, it really, really limits you to what you can do. And so we think on all these levels, privacy is critical to get blockchain to a point of mass adoption.
What would you say is the difference between privacy issues when it comes to the current, I guess, Web2 and then Web3? Because I'm guessing most people don't understand, right? Like, sometimes we go on these like social platforms and there's a bunch of like, what is it called, terms and conditions, and who has time to read it? So you just go like, yes, I accept, So how is the blockchain really like solving it in the Web3 context?
Yeah, a lot of the current privacy paradigm in Web2 is trust me not to share your data with other people, right? Trust me to kind of protect your discretion, your privacy, your data integrity. And sometimes that trust can be believed, and sometimes that trust cannot be believed. If you are sending plain text data to a Web2 server, you can pretty much know that your privacy has already been violated. Whether that your information is shared with other people or not, that's a question. But if data is leaving your computer unencrypted, somebody is going to receive it and be able to see everything that you're doing. And so Web2 is in a high trust situation where we oftentimes trust our counterparties and our platforms to protect our privacy, but oftentimes they do a really poor job, right? And it rolls all the way up to nation states that do a really bad job of protecting privacy. In the United States, there was a credit agency called Equifax, and they collected the credit information of nearly everyone in the United States. They're one of the 3 largest credit agencies. And they said, we're protecting all of your credit card applications, your mortgage information, your car loans. We have all that information, and trust us, we've got it protected. Well, it turns out they really didn't. And then they leaked all that information because they got hacked a couple of years ago. And so nearly every American's credit information was leaked onto the internet. Well, that's a situation in which we were told to trust a central entity that did not custody the data in a very compliant way. And then the data gets leaked because it was just unencrypted. It was just stored on some text file somewhere, and that's basically what happened. The country of Argentina recently about a year ago, suffered a leak of many of their citizens' Social Security, their equivalent of Social Security information. And so, our belief is that Web2 is placing trust in centralized parties to keep your data private. And our belief is you shouldn't have to trust any central party. You should be able to build a system where data is fully encrypted before it leaves your computer. And even once it leaves your computer, there's no one central actor who can open all these unencrypted messages and read what's inside. And so that's how I would kind of compare Web2 privacy, where there is this assumption of privacy that's not always true, and our type of privacy, which I would call unimpeachable privacy. Once you get our privacy guarantee, truly nobody, including us, can open up your data and see what's inside.
How can privacy be used as a creative force for peace? I mean, how can that, could you explain how that can be? Because I think it's a very interesting topic and potential concern, for people when it comes to peace information, so if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, some of the largest proponents of privacy are actually human rights organizations and journalists, right? So journalists are some of the largest adopters of Signal, which is an end-to-end encrypted messaging app. Why? Because freedom of the press is very much dependent on non-censorship and discretion. If I, as a journalist, am collecting sensitive information from somebody and I can't be guaranteed discretion, I might be putting lives at risk, right? In order to discover the truth really cannot be censored anywhere on the path from being reported on to being discovered to being communicated to the broader public. And so I see privacy very much as a force for peace and for truth. It's very hard to speak honestly unless you know your privacy is being protected, right? So a lot of human rights organizations want to make sure that people can speak honestly without being snooped on by authoritarian governments. I will say at Aztec, some of our largest users come from countries where financial freedom is highly restricted and where they are concerned about authorities being able to see all of their financial transactions. I think we in the West, because we have many more freedoms than in other countries, we take it for granted that I can send things with full privacy. I cannot be persecuted. Nobody is looking over my shoulder to say, I'm going to take this person's livelihood. I'm going to take this person's funds. That's not true for many people around the world. And so privacy is a form of protection. It's a form of human freedom.
So from your perspective, and you're caring about this topic, what do you think is important to keep an ecosystem thriving on the blockchain and healthy? Because I feel like we have a lot of scams and rug pulls and stolen accounts, and I'm wondering how can we really, like you being on mainly focused on Ethereum, maybe how do they keep a healthy ecosystem thriving and making sure that there's this level of equal messaging, equal trust, and all these things?
Yeah, obviously one of the answers that I'm going to lean toward is I think privacy helps protect users, right? If you don't really know who to attack, if all the users look the same, then executing an attack becomes much, much harder. But if I can read every single person's address and write a bot that scrapes all the addresses and tells me who has the NFTs I want to steal, who has the tokens that I want to steal, identify those addresses, and then let me try to link those addresses to real world identities. That's a huge security issue, right? Like you can imagine that, of course, it's a very adversarial environment that's full of scams and fraud because it's really easy to intercept some of these people's information and to delineate kind of, hey, here's high value users, here are low value users, so let me attack the high value users. So obviously, I think privacy is part of having a healthier ecosystem. I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that privacy will unlock a bunch of development that we haven't seen before, right? You get these smart contract dynamics that you might not otherwise have in a public blockchain environment. And so in terms of not just security, but in terms of creativity, the hope is you get much more interesting games, you get much more interesting exchanges, you get much more interesting financial products once you add this element of privacy. And we think one of the things that's blocking mass adoption and the explosion of, the developer transition from Web 2 to Web 3 is this inability to create with privacy as a dynamic. I mean, imagine if Web 2 had default public state. Imagine if Web 2 by default had no privacy. Would we have seen any adoption in Web 2 if all of your emails could be read by anyone, if all your bank transactions could be read by anyone, if all of the games that you play and the websites that you visit and every single thing was published to a public blockchain? I'm not sure we would have seen any adoption in Web 2. And so, yeah, we're very, very excited about the type of robust ecosystem and developer dynamics that will hopefully be unlocked once we introduce privacy.
As you were talking, I just couldn't help but think about like the blockchain technology, and I'm going to play like the devil's advocate here because people are so skeptical when they hear blockchain. All they think about is scam, scam, scam. So if, blockchain is this like evolution of, I guess, like transparency, data, privacy, and all of these amazing things, why is it that it is in this, space that we kind of have to deal with all these, like, scam concerns and people are so skeptical? Like, why is that?
Yeah, I think that's a funny question because the vast majority of fraud in the world does not happen on the blockchain. And in fact, it's been shown that there actually isn't an incongruent amount of fraud on blockchains and that it's not being used for money laundering and it's not being used for criminal activity. For example, right? I think one of the reasons why it seems like there's a lot of scams happening is because it's fully transparent.
Right.
We can see everything happening in real time. In reality, there's many, many billions of dollars of financial fraud that go through the traditional banking system. So why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about the fact that people get scammed into giving their account numbers up, or they lose their social security numbers and identity fraud happens, or you get a scam phone call that says, hey, it's your bank's customer service, give me all your information, and people fall for that. Why is that not so obvious? The reason is because all of that fraud happens in closed systems. It's actually very hard to measure how much fraud is happening because you have to ask banks. And you have to say, hey, how much fraud happened within your bank? And are banks really incentivized to fully disclose like the amount of fraud? And here's the other thing. People say, there's a lot of friction in bank networks because there needs to be fraud protection, right? I had a wire go out the other day and it got blocked by the bank because I added a new wire address. So like, of course, in order to send a new wire, I have to add a new wire address. And they said, you added a new wire address and it tripped our fraud protection. And I'm like, okay, under what condition would it not have tripped your fraud protection, right? It's a new address. So it's just not clear why that happened. Because there's so much fraud protection, that's evidence of how much fraud is happening on traditional banking rails. There's billions of dollars of scams and frauds happening. The reason why I think blockchain gets such a bad rep when it comes to scams and fraud, a couple things. Number one, you can see it all happen in real time. So imagine if we could see every single fraudulent transaction, someone taking your credit card at the bar and like swiping it later to like buy a MacBook. Has totally happened to me, right? You call your bank, someone stole my credit card, shut it down, right? Why don't we talk about that? Because you can't see it. If we could just go to Etherscan and see all the bank fraud that's happening at JP Morgan, at Bank of America, at all these major international banks, you would see an immense amount of fraud, but we don't because they're closed systems and they're not transparent, so we can't see it. That's number one. And number two, very unfortunately, early on in Bitcoin's history, this is like 10 years ago, Bitcoin was thought to be a private currency and it was thought to be useful for criminal transactions. And so there were these criminal transactions that were happening on stuff like Silk Road, right? Silk Road was this like online drug buying platform and a lot of people on there transacted in Bitcoin. And so very early on, cryptocurrency got this bad reputation for being used for criminal activity. In reality, the vast amount of criminal activity and money laundering that happens goes through cash and goes through the traditional banking system. And if you don't believe me, then look up the fact that HSBC helped facilitate almost $1 billion of money laundering for the Sinaloa Mexican drug cartel. This is a traditional regulated international bank facilitating money laundering for a criminal drug organization. So again, I'm not saying bad things don't happen on blockchain. Human beings are human beings.
Right.
No matter what technology we invent, there's going to be bad people out there and they're going to try to do bad things. I just think we unfairly have this characterization as the home of fraud and scams, when in reality, it's not happening at a higher rate than anywhere else.
The perspective you gave is really, really powerful because it makes a lot of sense. And I think we need to like work to change the narrative.
Like it's also, like you said, media and the narrative, like obviously the people who are involved in these things, they don't necessarily might like the blockchain or things happening. They don't necessarily have an interest of fostering these ecosystems or really thinking about decentralizations because it would mean something to their projects and to what they're doing. So I think it's just like the things we might as normal people not seeing, and blockchain can maybe bring more transparency. Is it like perfect right now with what we have? I don't think so, but I think it's better if we think about DeFi, what it can actually do for people around the world. And yeah, so I'm happy you pointed it out. And I have another question, and that is, what do you think as a normal person, what can I do on a daily basis to protect my data, protect my privacy, and thrive in the Web3 and blockchain space? Like, what if I consider using blockchain, what do I look at? Like, which projects do I look at? So like maybe a little guide on like what you suggest, or not suggest, but saying, okay, if you're a normal person, you're new to the space, I would move there, I would do this, or think about certain things.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that like most of blockchain doesn't have true privacy, but I would say some of the best practices that you could do for your own security is number one, have a hardware wallet so that you have to have this object that has to connect in order for you to execute a transaction. Hot wallets are really easy to hijack. Number two, you have to just practice good, internet hygiene. Never download any attachments, never respond to a message whose sender you're not aware of. Never answer a phone call from an unknown number. These are just kind of basic protect yourself type moves. But even after all that, it behooves you to kind of like create a new address if you're trying to do a new transaction, if you're interacting with something you're not sure about. One of the problems that can exist in blockchain is if you use one address for all of your activity, if that address gets compromised, all your balance might get drained. And so a very common thing for people to do is just create new wallet addresses for every single activity they do. Have one wallet address for this type of token, have one wallet address for another type of token. And is that more annoying? Is that like a little bit more painful? Sure. But it's going to at least silo your economic activity so that if there's an attack on that address, you might be okay. Now, of course, that doesn't protect you from a seed phrase attack. So you have to still be very, very careful about your seed phrase. Always write down your seed phrase, never put it, on a computer, never put it on a digital device, never put it to an internet connected device. Write it down on a piece of paper, put it in a safe, put it under your bed. Ideally put it on some kind of crypto steel so that like in case your house burns down, you still have access to your funds. I think to casual observers looking at this, they say, wow, crypto is such a pain. Like that's so annoying to have to do all this security. And it's like, well, so be it. If you don't want to take these steps to protect yourself, don't use crypto. The promise of crypto is basically saying, I trust myself. I trust myself more than I trust my bank. And so on some level, it's a little bit of a cynical technology, right? It's to say, I trust myself to not lose my private keys more than I trust my bank not to lose my data or my information. And so, yeah, you have to take all of these very painful steps to protect yourself. And then even then, there's very limited blockchain privacy. It's well known that, federal authorities are observing everything that's happening in centralized exchanges, in FTX, in Coinbase, in Binance. So don't think to yourself, oh, I'm going to do some criminal activity by using Coinbase, FTX, and Binance. The FBI in the United States has made it hyper clear that they know exactly everything that's happening on crypto rails right now. And so there is no kind of like true privacy in Web3 yet. Obviously, Aztec is working on end-to-end encryption, and we will still allow you to audit your own transactions. So you can furnish a receipt that says, hey, I didn't do anything badly to authorities if they ask for it. But we're trying to design a system where there's no backdoor, where no central authority can kind of like look through the looking glass and see all of the activity that's happening. Whereas that's exactly what's happening today. Everyone can see everything.
Yeah, great points. And also, like, I think you kind of touched a little bit on it, but maybe we could dive into it a bit deeper. Like, what do you think are the biggest opportunities and challenges for existing blockchain networks, maybe platforms as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think the two most important things right now are privacy and scalability. You need to introduce this new privacy mechanic that allows you to do private smart contracts and private payments. Imagine if you had to put everyone's salary online. Would you work for a company that published the salary of every single person's work? Would companies want to participate in that ecosystem, right? So it allows, privacy introduces all of these dynamics that we really value in the real world. And the second is scalability, right? We need to make sure that blockchain transactions are affordable. And we need to make them affordable without compromising on security. And that's why we think ZK rollups like Aztec are very promising, because they implement dramatic cost reduction while also having irrefutable security via this kind of magical encryption technology called zero knowledge proofs. It's important that anyone around the world be able to transact on these rails. Otherwise, we're just building technology for a very small number of people. It's known, for instance, that most of the Ethereum activity is done by a very small number of accounts with huge net worth and balances. And so if this technology is going to be about extending access to the average user, extending some of these things that we take for granted in the West, like privacy and free and instant transactions to everybody in the world, then we need it to be affordable. right? And so I think those are some of the biggest challenges that we have facing us today.
Well said. It needs to be secure. It needs to be scalable, and it needs to be also accessible for most of the people. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today. I think really this episode got me so many new insights on why privacy is so important, and I think it will be so good for the community. And we would also love to know where our community can find you on your social platforms to learn more about Aztec and about yourself.
So you can find us on Twitter at Aztec Network. That's AZTEC Network. And you can find me on Twitter at JONWU_. That's John Woo _.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think this was a super well articulated episode on privacy and, you know, just like learning more about the blockchain technology and how it kind of like sort of accelerate all of this and makes all of this happen. So thank you so much, you know, for teaching us more about that. And thank you, Joy, and thank you everyone for being a part of this forum. And if you want to get more involved in our community, be sure to follow us on our social platforms. IG is newcoin.nco and our website is newcoin.org. You can also join our Discord group, and we'll have all the links in the description below, as well as Jonathan's links. And take a moment, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and we will see you in the next episode.